When you look at the topic of this Knowledge Connect, and I did a word cloud of some of the content that's in this edition of Knowledge Connect, you can see the kinds of things that came up, and you can see I was playing a little bit with the word cloud software, so I've got different coloured ones and different fonts. But you can see, if you have a look at the sorts of ideas that this Knowledge Connect covers, you can sort of group them into 4 areas. First, you've got the leadership ideas, so things like leadership or change, people, courage, adaptive. They're all ideas around leadership. There's also ideas around situations, so, and I guess the world at the moment, the reality. So systems, complex, reality, solutions, problems, world, sustainability, they're all in there as well. And there's also, which is a very important part of what we're talking about in this edition of Knowledge Connect, is ideas about thinking and perceiving, so how we perceive the world, our perspectives, our approaches, our understandings, reality, values, they're all there as well. And finally, and I think most importantly, because that's where I'm going to finish up today, is the idea of relationships, the relational words. So things like networking, dialogue, collaborate, stakeholders, interaction. All of that comes out when you have a look at the sorts of issues that we've covered in this Knowledge Connect. And I think this is the ground that we're going to be covering, and I encourage you to have a read through those articles if you haven't had a chance to already. But I want to start with systems thinking and the idea of thinking and perceiving the world and the situations we face in a particular way. And trying to, I guess, capture it visually. I was just talking with one of our participants about how we like to capture ideas visually. But one of the ideas, the main ideas about systems thinking is this really important idea of taking a step back and having a look at the big picture. So often when we're in a leadership position, we're so caught up in actions and decisions that we never really get the chance to take a step back and think about what they actually mean. So the first thing that systems thinking encourages you to do is to first start asking yourself questions. What are the approaches and understandings of the world that led me to make those decisions, which in turn led to those actions? So it's a way of thinking about yourself, and then even going further up, if you like, further up in terms of distance, what are the perspectives? So what kind of a perspective do I have on this situation? And that often comes from our discipline. So if you're a social worker, you'll come from a social work perspective. If you're a political scientist, you'll come from a political science perspective. If you're a psychologist, you'll come from a psychology perspective. All of those things shape what we see. But above that, it's our mental models, which is how we make sense of the world. And even further above that is this idea of paradigms. So it's a whole worldview. So a worldview about human nature, for example. Is human nature inherently good? Is it something that could be understood scientifically? Is it something that is more than science can actually tell us? So all of those things are part of systems thinking. But the idea of stepping back, the other element of systems thinking is how we understand causes and effects and conditions. So that often, I think in this world nowadays, we've got this linear model of thinking. So we've got a set of conditions which gives rise to a cause, and which in turn gives rise to a set of effects. What we don't see is that each of those conditions have their own subsystems. So you might have urban society as a set of conditions. What are some of the things that cause problems in urban society? They themselves have subsystems, and the effects have subsystems. So, and what makes things even more complex is that there are feedback loops between all of them. So say we make an urban intervention, perhaps if you look at social housing in Britain and even Australia in the 60s, there was an intervention to do something about social housing that led to them building these large tower blocks, and anyone who's been to the UK would have seen them. That particular intervention has created its own set of conditions and causes which actually made the problems worse that they were trying to fix. So systems thinking, I guess, is a way of understanding that. And the best way to understand systems thinking is to think a little bit about a particular example. So I thought about something that's been always in the newspapers, and it's this idea of improving education outcomes. So why is it that some kids in some parts of Sydney do really well and other kids do really poorly? Why is it that Indigenous kids and kids in rural areas don't do as well in terms of education outcomes as other children in other parts of Australia. So and if you think about what some of those causes might be, you can put them into 4 sort of categories. So you've got schools themselves, you've got the teachers in the schools, you've got the classroom environment, and you've got home environment. But what happens is that we start doing interventions like NAPLAN, national testing, okay, like curriculum changes. We also start doing things like wanting to performance manage teachers. So hire and fire, decentralise the hiring and firing. All of those interventions have effects. So what are some of the effects of the NAPLAN and then the publication of those results on my school website? One of the unintended effects is that people start gaming the system. So they start teaching to the test and coaching kids to do it. One of the other unintended effects of that is that as school quality goes up, perceived in the minds of people, then they get more resources. And so more resources lead to teachers leaving other schools in order to go there. So you're getting this feedback loop of unintended consequences. It may mean some parents then prefer to send their kids to some schools, which then means that the resources available to the schools that perhaps need it aren't there. So you're getting already these feedback loops. You get teachers burning out because they're under-resourced. The classrooms may suffer from resource problems in terms of hardware, support staff, and other resources, facilities, and also in terms of the other kids there. So as resources go into some schools, they attract a certain kind of usually homogeneous mix of kids who may be better at learning and more adaptable in learning. What that means is that those kids are taken away from the comprehensive public schools, which in turn leads to more teacher burnout and perhaps more teachers leaving the system. So what happens is, and even at home you've got other things like the home environment, the parental support, and just even how much food and sleep kids have before they come into school, so their well-being. So there's a whole lot of causes and effects of this idea of using education, but what we do is we pull a lever and we say, let's publish all of the school's performance on a website, and that will lead to an improvement in the problem. So what systems thinking is saying is that you can't think like that. You can't look at simple causes and effects, because there are these ripple effects of unintended consequences and positive, negative feedback. So does that make sense, using that example? There's another example that I think is interesting too, and that's about solving crime. And this comes from the work of Louis Beckett. But if you think about social turbulence and problems that happen in many urban societies, living in a fragmented way, commuting long distances to work, people living on their own, quite often when you have a disconnected society, that can lead to increased crime. And the traditional approach, which is what he calls reactive policing, means that you start throwing police resources in, putting people in jail and trying to improve the crime situation that way. Now, the unintended consequence of that is that media publicity, and anyone who listens to talkback radio would know and reads the tabloid press, makes people afraid of crime. And what that does, and this is again a negative feedback loop, an unintended consequence, what that does is it means that people don't go out. They're more fearful. They don't connect with their neighbours. Their neighbours are the other. They could be potentially criminals, which then has a negative effect on how cohesive the society is, which in turn increases the crime rate. So the idea of dealing with it, these kind of issues, means that you have to think about those ripple effects, those unintended consequences. And if you think about this self-reinforcing negative feedback, which makes the situation worse, you need to realise that maybe we should be looking instead at the whole system, okay, and trying to, instead of trying to work at the bottom of the system by putting people in jail, to actually build up things like neighbouring, community building, reducing fear of the other, because that will then lead to a self-reinforcing positive cycle. Okay, so systems thinking is about making the connections, understanding the system, and thinking about maybe trying to intervene at higher levels. And I'll talk to you a little bit about what intervening at higher levels mean. But I think one of the things about systems thinking is that sometimes when you draw things out like this, it just becomes overwhelming. And you know, a lot of the early systems theorists used to map everything out and then say, okay, we've done our job, we can go home now. Now, if you're a leader in an organisation trying to practically apply this, you can just get overwhelmed and think, well, it's too hard, I think I'll just go back to my simplified models of learning. And that's something that Peter Singer said some time ago in the fifth discipline. You know, you just think there's nothing I can do. But I think what those of us who have used systems thinking in our leadership practice and in our teaching is to understand that it's actually an antidote to that helplessness. Because I think nowadays the world is so complex, and we're seeing all of these complex ripple effects more quickly than we did in the past. So you can feel helpless, and you can feel it's too hard, I've got to take my bat and my ball and go home. So I think one of the things that we talk about in this Knowledge Connect is the work of Donella Meadows, who has this book here, which I would really recommend if you're interested in getting a book, either this or the fifth discipline if you don't have them. They're both really practical ways of understanding how to apply systems thinking to leadership. So, but she talks about leverage points, and it's not about pushing buttons like bringing in decentralised hiring and firing or putting up a My School website. It's not about those really simple things. It's about understanding where you can have the most, if you go back to that last slide, the most effective self-reinforcing positive feedback, okay? So, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So what happens is that you get these systems traps when you try and do things at the simple level. If you try and reduce a complex problem down to something simple and scientific, you get things like policy resistance, which is what happens when an intervention actually makes the situation worse, as the My School website looks like it's starting to do. So that's in systems thinking, that's called policy resistance, or fixes that fail, things that are actually failing. And what's the solution to that? If you don't understand the full range of feedback loops, and feedback can happen over time and in different places, not just, and I think our I guess, fascination with short-term performance measures and short-term outcomes means that we get out of the habit of looking for feedback loops. But if you step back and think about feedback over time and in different places, you do then start to see this bigger picture. So the trick in policy resistance is to let go. Right, let go of the need to go and do something quickly about a problem, a social problem. Understand the system first. Understand what the feedback loops are, whether they're positive or negative. And that's hard for us to do as leaders, because I think, again, our society encourages people to be fixers of problems. And it's quite rewarding to fix problems. I mean, I know I worked in a leadership position myself, and it's really good to go in and say, here's a problem, I can fix it. I know something that'll, it makes us look good. I mean, we call it bushfire fighting in Australia. So, but, you know, it really is about working out where to build the fire trails and what to do about that bushfire system, rather than trying to go in and fight things. Another one of the systems traps that Donella Meadows talks about is the tragedy of the commons, and some of you will be familiar about that. The classic example of that is the overfishing and the seafood stock. So where you have a limited resource and people take that limited resource that is shared by everybody as if it belongs to them, and then totally leads to the extinction of that resource, because all resources have limits. And I guess the question is, why do people destroy the commons? Why is it that people who are fishing are actually overfishing and destroying the commons? Because they have a whole lot of inputs and causes and conditions that make them need to go and do that. Okay, so it might be easier for us to stop, to say there's something wrong with it, don't do it, but we need to understand, again, the system that created that. So there are a whole lot of systems traps that Donella Meadows talks about. So, and I think from a leadership perspective, it's about understanding how to think about systems a little bit differently. And I've got these written down in the Knowledge Connect. But things like stepping back, understanding your mental models, paying attention to what's important, not just to what we can measure. And I think that's really important in the social world and in terms of social impact. And I think the CSI is doing some really good stuff in that area in terms of measurement. Look for the good of the whole. Defy the disciplines. So if you're a psychologist, think about it the way a political scientist views the world. Think about the way an engineer views the world. So go beyond our disciplines and our ways of thinking. And expanding the boundary of caring. Okay, so that means that we need to start caring about more than just our own selves. I think for any of the people in this room, that's already happening by default. But for leaders, it's about encouraging that elsewhere through their organisation. Because quite often, even in social organisations, the people that are working for you, the employees, the volunteers, you don't necessarily know how they're responding to their job conditions, and quite often they're working under immense stress and they may be miserable. So it's a matter of understanding not just the big system pictures that you're trying to make better, but your own staff and your own volunteers. So I just, to sort of finish up on that, one of the other papers that I reviewed, and it's a paper as well as a nice animation by the RSA, is this idea of 21st century enlightenment. And that's about questioning our mental models and our paradigms. If you think about the Enlightenment, when science became, I guess, known with Isaac Newton and Galileo, that was about breaking free of the belief structures and the paradigms. So no longer did religion explain why the world worked. We had science. What the RSA are arguing is that we need a new kind of breaking free of our belief systems. And we need to break free of our belief in the markets, the belief that science can fix everything, and the belief that if we have rules, everything will be okay. Okay, and that's quite challenging, but it's a similar kind of enlightenment. And I'd really recommend that you have a look at the animation, and the links are provided in the website, because it talks about how we can build empathic understanding, and that's a way of extending the boundaries of caring. So that's a really important way of, I guess, breaking free and understanding systems better. So we've talked about understanding, we've talked about perspectives and ways of understanding the world. I want to bring it back now to leadership. Because as a leader, and David mentioned it, one of the things that we talk about in our CSI course is that leadership is not about the person, it's about the process. And in a complex adaptive system, which is what our social world is now, you can't just depend on yourself as a source of expertise, because you've only got one. It doesn't matter how good you are at systems thinking, you won't get the full picture unless you engage in dialogue with others. So one of the really important processes that underpins leadership and for complex systems is this idea of dialogue. The only way that you can find out other people's mental models, the only way you can find out other perspectives and other long-term effects is to talk to your stakeholders and to listen to your stakeholders. Often dialogue, people say that they're engaging in dialogue when what they're doing is just ramming their point of view down someone else's throat. Okay, and that's something that we can't afford to do nowadays. I think with adaptive leadership, we really need to have that listening, that understanding of how other parts of the system are being affected. Now, that's complex, that's messy, and that's time-consuming. And I think, again, our search for quick fix solutions means that we're not happy with that. It's uncomfortable for us as leaders. But if you can have reflective conversation with your stakeholders, with your staff, with your volunteers, you can understand their mental models and you can get a more cohesive worldview and a better sense of how things can be solved. So the other thing is that you need to then understand the complexity of the whole system, and finally, in terms of leadership, to to share a vision and develop a shared vision. So, and this is what we mean by distributed leadership, this idea of collectively developing a shared vision of where you want to take your organisation. So again, it's not this hero leader, this Richard Branson type coming in and running an organisation. It just doesn't work nowadays. So from a leadership perspective, I think it's something that is challenging for us, but it's also really important. And it gets us back to these fundamental questions of who we are as human beings, who we need to be as human beings, and I guess who we aspire to be and who we aspire to be as an organisation. So those areas, if we go back to our cloud, our word cloud, summarise a lot of the things that we've been talking about in systems thinking. And just a practical way of doing that has been given to us by David Cooperrider, and that's this idea of appreciative inquiry, which is a practical thing that you can do with your people so that you can actually learn to develop shared vision, listen to others, ask questions and empower people to then go out and try and solve the problems collectively. So there are lots of examples in the Knowledge Connect of how people do this in practice, and I would really encourage you, if you're interested in this, to have a look at some of the references that we put on Knowledge Connect. So to just explore this and maybe take some experimental steps yourself in trying to do some of the things that Donella Meadows recommends, that John Sturman recommends, that Marine recommends, and that the RSA recommend. I think all of these people, the articles that I chose for this edition are all based on practice. Okay, in leadership you can often get a lot of really theoretical stuff that doesn't really benefit people, but this is all based on practice and on how to actually do things on the ground, because that's where I come from as a leader. From my perspective, is how to make things happen on the ground is actually so much more important than theories and ideas. So systems thinking, even though it can be complex, is a practical tool. It's a practical thing that you can apply to leadership. So I think I should finish up there so that we've got room for some discussion and Q&As. Thank you for listening.